Hi everyone, and welcome to Collapse Astrology. Welcome back if you've caught one of my other videos. I'm Hummingbird, and today we're going to be getting into Kamala Harris's natal chart. This video is part of a series that I'm doing on the astrology of the United States presidential election. There are already videos out on Biden and Trump, which are linked below, and there were definitely people on both of those videos that did not like my interpretations. On the Trump video, there was somebody who said that I had Trump derangement syndrome. On the Biden video, there was someone who called me a stupid Trumpist astrologer. So I don't know. I kind of feel like that means I'm doing something right if people can't tell what side I'm on. And the truth is, with both Trump and Biden, I am just sick of both of their faces, both of their energy fields. I'm sick of their Pluto and Leo boomer narcissism, and the snark about them is how I cope. That is just going to be how it is on this channel. But with Kamala, she's got Pluto in Virgo, so she is a different generation. And I do feel like I'm coming in from a more humane and empathetic angle, although I do not like Kamala Harris. I do not support her policy-wise or feel like she is, gonna save democracy or anything like that. And I can't really like or respect anyone in the political establishment if they haven't explicitly come out against the unaliving of children. But even though Kamala has not done that, that doesn't mean that she is not a complex human with complex roots. And I can really see that in her chart. And honestly, it's just a breath of fresh air compared to the old white men that I've been talking about the past two videos. So if you are here from one of my other videos, if you did like my style enough to have subscribed, I'm really grateful for that. And I hope you like this video too. I hope you find it grounding and supportive of your own process in navigating this crazy election season that we're in. So let me go ahead and pull up her chart, and we'll just start with a summary of what I see here. So Kamala has an Aries moon, a Libra sun, Gemini rising. Her Mercury is in Scorpio, her Venus is in Virgo, her Mars is in Leo. So her inner planets, her personal planets are all spread out in different signs, which is interesting. And then there are lots of other interesting specifics in this chart. So she has her nodes on the horizon line. Her south node is on the descendant. Her north node is on the ascendant. This axis and this nodal placement is really relevant to the election chart. She has her moon in very late Aries, 27 Aries. Anything in late Aries is always interesting. Her sun and her Mercury are in the 5th house, but she also has this very intense 4th house placement that involves Venus, Pluto, and Uranus. Her Mars is in Leo in the 3rd house. And then the top of her chart is also super interesting to me. There's Saturn, there's Vesta, there is Chiron. And this is a very challenging and unique energetic relating to her career, her reputation, her legacy, her process of chasing her destiny, whatever that might be. And this is all getting activated right now. Saturn is transiting this area of her chart, and especially in the election chart, Saturn is very relevant here. So we're going to start with Kamala's childhood, which means we're going to start with this 4th house alignment. And this is a very intense, very tight conjunction between these 3 planets, a combination of power, revolution, femininity. But there's also quite a kind of harsh energy here. So we'll see different layers of this as we get into Kamala's early family life. Kamala Harris is the child of 2 immigrants. Her father, Donald, is from Jamaica and immigrated to study at Berkeley in the early 60s. And her mother, Shyamala, is from India and also immigrated to study at Berkeley in the early 60s. So her parents met there and bonded as part of the Black radical movement that was burgeoning in the Bay Area at that time. And they were part of a wave of new political consciousness and were connected to early activists like Cedric Robinson and others who went on to be leaders in the civil rights movement. Kamala was born in 1964, and she has one sister who is 2 years younger than her. And her mother and father were just finishing their higher education when Kamala was born, but her father later became an economics professor at Stanford, while her mother graduated with a PhD in nutrition and endocrinology from Berkeley and became a respected cancer researcher and biophysicist later in life. So we'll go deeper into this, but even just on the surface with this information, there are some interesting astrological overlaps. There's the revolutionary impulse of Uranus. There is the power theme of Pluto. And there's also a theme of intellectualism with the sign of Virgo. The leftist radical culture that brought Kamala's parents together was a culture where political ideas were constantly debated, something that Virgo loves, and where everyone was searching for practical solutions, something that Virgo is famously good at. And the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo basically is the civil rights movement. Like if you're going to choose a long-term transit to represent that movement, it is this transit. It lasted throughout the entire 60s. It featured Uranian themes of rebellion and mass uprising, pushing against Pluto's themes of death and power. And for Kamala, with this energy in the fourth house, it was very close to her in childhood. It was what brought her parents together, and it was an energy, that I can only imagine was present, especially in her early childhood. Kamala's parents got divorced when she was around 7. This is according to her 2019 memoir. Her mother became a single mother after that, while her father eventually moved away from the area. So there were some turbulent years that lasted through Kamala's early teens, which makes sense with the placement of this stellium, just turbulence right in the middle of her childhood, right in the middle of her fourth house. Kamala's mother had some help from the radical community in the Bay Area in those years, and then things stabilized for her family when they moved to Montreal, and Kamala's mother took a research position at McGill University. So you can definitely see a tradition of hard work and intellectual devotion in the family, which are Virgo traits. And because of the Venus placement here, you can see the impact, especially that Kamala's mother made on her, the combination of the feminine with that hard work ethic and that intellectual drive. I couldn't find much information about the specifics of the divorce, which isn't surprising. With Uranus and Pluto and Virgo, there are some darker potentials here, which I'm going to explore a little bit later on because it's very relevant to the darker sides of her career and to Chiron and Pisces here across the chart. But regardless of the specifics, it looks like there was definitely some kind of a break or a rupture that happened pretty early in her life and then settled out by her mid-teens. Kamala didn't have a good relationship with her father and was separated from him for a long time. They are reconciled now, but in general, he's pretty private. There's not a ton of information about him out there. But there is a lot more information about her mother, Shyamala Gopalan Harris. So Shyamala was born in Chennai, India. Her family belonged to the highest level, quote unquote, priestly caste of Brahmins, which I will circle back to. Shyamala was the youngest of 4 children and had relatively progressive, educated parents who allowed their very smart and determined daughter to go study biochemistry in the U.S. after she applied to Stanford, without anyone in her family knowing, and got in. Shyamala is described as being about 5 feet tall, but with an aura of royalty, so a tiny but powerful, smart, and opinionated woman. And this is one layer deeper into the Venus, Uranus, Pluto, Virgo presence. From childhood, Kamala had the example of a strong female presence, hardworking, self-sustaining, which are Virgo traits, and also the presence of Uranus and Pluto in her mother's community, which supported her, especially when she was a newly single mother. In that sense, Kamala grew up witnessing and believing that a woman could do anything that she chose. I also imagine, though, that it was a really strict upbringing, which can definitely be a shadow of Virgo, even sliding into abuse or other dark potentials. There could have been a lot of academic pressure or rigid social rules. Her mother could have wanted Kamala to spend all her time on homework. They could have not haven't had enough money for luxuries or for participating in social activities. What I imagine is that there was a really strict upbringing, and then also Kamala's own ambition, just by her own choice. She probably worked super hard and was probably pretty straight edge through high school. And then I kind of think that she became a partier once she moved away from home. And beyond just partying, I think that the next phase of her life, her 20s, was probably huge for her as she moved towards a more developed knowing of herself. So the fourth house describes childhood. And then the fifth house describes the awakening of self and individual authenticity that can only really fully happen once we leave the nest, which is represented by the fourth house, and begin to construct our own ego, our own identity. So that kind of ego and identity theme is the link between the fifth house, which is associated with the sign of Leo, and the sun, which rules Leo. So Kamala's got her sun and her Mercury here. And between 1982 and 1988, so between when she was 18 to 24, she had some really wild transits. Uranus was in Sagittarius. It was transiting all her Sag planets, her descendant, her south node, and Pluto was conjuncting first her sun in Libra and then her Mercury in Scorpio. So Kamala went to undergrad at Howard and HBCU in Washington, D.C., and she might have already had some establishment connections through her mother, because plenty of Black radicals from the 60s did end up in the establishment by the 80s. But if she didn't have those connections already, they were probably right there for the taking at Howard. And I think Kamala really started to touch that third rail of political power in those years, and maybe started to get seduced by it and by her own potential, the way that she saw herself possibly being able to play that game. Her personal astrology really shows an interesting combination of energies that ultimately look like ambition and like someone who could really make a big impact. So Kamala was born at a full moon. You'll notice the moon and the sun are exactly opposite one another. And she has this late Aries moon in the 11th house. So an Aries moon in general is pretty fearless. This one is very public. It's very able to reach crowds. And when she does it right, this is a really, really powerful placement. There's also been, I think, a very grotesque example of this Aries moon in all its hubris and arrogance, which are shadow Aries traits, in the way that Kamala responded to protesters at her Wisconsin rally last week. But in general, this is a pretty powerful trait that she has. A public moon like this is something that people can resonate with beyond an intellectual level, so it can be really, really impactful in somebody who is trying to stir up emotions. And Aries energy also has the ability to push boundaries. It can speak truth to power. It can awaken passion. It can even awaken a very core level survival drive in us. And then the fact that this is a full moon with a strong late Libra sun to kind of balance it out makes it have even more potential. Now, Libra is very justice oriented. It is related to law. So that might have been one reason that Kamala was drawn to go to law school and get into politics. But also, as she began to develop her sun and have this fifth house awakening, she probably started to recognize the impact that she could have. And this Libra Sun is just inherently someone with a strong sense of fairness and balance, a lot of passion, and also the talent that Libra has of reading the room, code switching, building bridges, networking, all of those kinds of things, which are pretty essential in the world of politics. Meanwhile, this Mercury in Scorpio is very psychological, strategic, intuitive, almost a mind reader. She may have been a little naive coming in. This kind of early placement is at 1 degree Scorpio, so there can be kind of some naivete in planets like that, but it also means that that planet is very open to new possibilities and to learning. And this Mercury in Scorpio, it is drawn to the dark side of things. It's drawn to the taboo. And again, I would think very drawn to that third rail of power that runs through political elite circles. All of that is very Scorpio. Mercury in Scorpio, it's specifically related to the mind, and it just has a natural instinct for all of that and for how power is exercised. I think this placement also probably has good intuition about when to speak, when to share information, and when to keep its mouth closed. And then there's also this third house Mars in Leo, which is going to be a good communicator because it's in the third house. It's going to be a good networker of like local connections, a local, organizer. And it's going to be full of passion and enthusiasm, good at getting people to rally behind it or rally behind any cause that, someone with this placement might be taking up. So during this formative period between age 18 to 24, Pluto transited her Sun and then her Mercury. And I feel like there was some kind of radicalization that happened during that time, but a radicalization towards the establishment. If she had some anti-establishment blood flowing in her veins, if she had some anti-establishment sentiments maybe coming from pieces of her childhood, I think she probably got radicalized as she became closer to the establishment itself towards that type of power. She was living in DC. I mean, the whole city just reeks of political ambition. Pluto conjunct her Mercury especially kind of feels like a loss of innocence, maybe an introduction to the seamier sides of things. And when I said I think that she became a partier once she moved away from home, I do think that that's a big part of it. Partying is a fifth house thing, and there's a lot of partying that goes on in those elite political circles. Obviously, Kamala was an undergrad at this time. There's typically a lot of partying happening in general. Both her Sun and her Mercury would probably be into living it up, having a good time during this life phase of newfound freedom, no matter what, like even if there weren't Pluto transits happening. But the Pluto transit says that she might have been hooked into a different circuit beyond just like campus undergrads. I wouldn't be surprised if she was trying to hobnob and, maybe being successful at hobnobbing with powerful people early on in her life. So also during that same phase, 82 to 88, she had her first Uranus square, and Uranus transited her descendant in her south node. And so let's talk a little bit about the nodes here and this interesting horizon line. Gemini and the north node on the ascendant, and Sagittarius and the south node on the descendant. So the south node on the descendant means that she's comfortable on a soul level with relationship, partnership, interdependence, codependence also. And the big question for this lifetime's evolutionary journey is going to be something like, who am I as an individual? What singular essence am I trying to embody? Because that's what the ascendant is typically going to be about. But with Gemini rising, this is going to feel confusing. It's a little bit of a double whammy to have both Gemini and the North Node involved. The North Node indicates unfamiliar soul territory, a place in life where we kind of feel like a novice. And then Gemini, notoriously, is always changing. So somehow Kamala has to find integrity, a knowing of herself as an individual in the context of all this mutable, airy, mental Gemini energy. And I don't know, I mean, I could just see how this is a struggle, especially with the North Node there. And I think it's obvious at this point in her career that she's pretty much been a chameleon. She's changed her positions a lot with the political wind. And that will not make for a good legacy. But early on, it probably seemed like a big asset. Gemini rising has an ability to do small talk. It has code switching ability, just like Libra. It is very curious, good at asking questions. It's a natural storyteller. And this could be another example of what I've mentioned in a few of the other charts that I've read too, where the North Node kind of grabs the steering wheel, kind of runs away with the chart. So Kamala has probably met a lot of people through chit chat. She's probably talked her way into rooms, and she's probably ended up in places that maybe even she never would have expected to be because of this Gemini North Node rising. Now, I mentioned that Uranus transited the nodes at the same time that Pluto was transiting her Sun and Mercury. So Kamala went through undergrad at Howard, and then she moved back to San Francisco for law school. And I think there were probably important relationships formed. A few things about the planets here make me think there could have been some kind of sexual awakening for her at that time. It was 1987 when Uranus transited her South Node, and then she graduated in 89 and started working in San Francisco as a deputy district attorney in 1990. And it was around that time that she met Willie Brown. So Willie Brown, he later became the mayor of San Francisco, but when they met, he was the Speaker of the California Assembly, which is already a pretty powerful position, and she was a young, ambitious lawyer at the DA's office. And the two of them were known to have had an affair sometime around 1994. When Kamala was around 30 years old, Willie Brown was around 60 years old and married, although technically separated, or at least that's how the official narrative goes. He appointed her to two important positions around the time of their involvement, which interestingly was happening right at her Saturn return. And this history has turned into some pretty gross misogynist slander on the right, with people saying that she slept her way to the top, that kind of a thing. There's a new article in Politico that seems like it's an attempt to launder that story. It says that they, quote unquote, dated, but it more tries to portray Willie Brown as Kamala's mentor. But there's older reporting that definitely indicates that he was married at the time. And I've heard it said a few times on podcasts that she was very obviously his mistress, and it was a thing that was known in their circles. So here's the thing. You can't even begin to have a conversation about this without talking about patriarchy and the systemic dynamics at play here. Kamala's Mars in Leo, it does sneak up on its prey and pounce. That's how it gets what it wants. And Kamala could have been a pursuer, consciously or unconsciously. She could have, dare I say it, used her sexuality to climb the political ranks. But you can't just be like, ugh, that's so awful and immoral, and not talk about the systemic context. What if a man was a presidential candidate and it came out that he'd had an affair 30 years before with an older, powerful woman? Would anybody be interpreting that as like a character flaw? No, if anything, they would be blaming the woman and saying that she'd seduced him and abused her power. And also just the way that the patriarchy distributes power. It's much, much, much more likely that an older man will be holding power and that a younger woman will be easily seduced into giving away her sexuality, thinking that connection will help her to get to where she's trying to go, than vice versa. And there's still so much karmic wounding in our culture around the autonomy of women. It's still so recent that women gained autonomy, even just in being able to have our own bank accounts and get divorced. There's an embodied patterning, I think, that tells women that it's a good idea to share your sexuality with powerful men, that it's your best bet, not just for power and influence, but for survival. And that undercurrent is there whether someone is consciously following it or not. Plus, I don't know about y'all, this could just be my 12th house Scorpio South node, but I know I find power attractive. It's not a mental thing or a consciously chosen thing, but my body reacts. My endocrine system reacts to a powerful person. And that can mean a person who's just rooted in themselves, but also worldly power is attractive. And I think, for me, that is definitely something karmic playing out in my own body, my own hormones. So what I'm saying is that Kamala could have felt legit attraction to Willie Brown. She could easily have had the typical hope of the mistress that this man will leave his wife and marry her. She might have actively pursued him with this Mars and Leo, but that still doesn't mean she wasn't in an unbalanced power dynamic in that relationship. Probably a power dynamic that the person on the upper end of the dynamic should reject if they really have integrity. And if her political career did benefit from it, I also don't know that it's any more out of integrity than a platonic relationship that gets someone a special appointment, which is all the freaking time in politics. Like, that's what networking is. To be clear, it's not that Kamala wasn't qualified for what she was appointed for. It wasn't that she didn't do a good job, as far as I can tell. But I think both at the time it happened and now, it was clear that there was some connection between her relationship with the mayor and the appointments that she got. Kamala did not get married until 2014, interestingly, at her Chiron return, while the Willie Brown affair happened at her Saturn return. And as far as I can find, she spent the 20 years in between almost as a childless cat lady. There's a tiny bit of reporting on her having dated Montel Williams around the year 2000 because there are a few pictures of them together, but there's no evidence that there was any kind of a committed relationship. And I just find this interesting because if she did have any serious relationships, there's not any easily accessible information on them. And all this kind of makes me curious, like, could she be kind of ace? Could she be secretly gay? This is all completely speculation, but she did meet her husband on a blind date set up by friends. They were married less than a year after meeting. Could they be some kind of beards for one another? For the record, Kamala's husband was married before. He has 2 kids. Kamala has co-parented them. She has a good relationship with them. I'm not trying to say there's anything nefarious between them. It's just true that people with non-normative ways of being in politics and also in, the business world that her husband is in, people do often try to make themselves look normative from the outside if they are in any way not. It does not look good to be single, especially if you're a woman. So I don't know. Who knows? Just some speculation there. Now, Chiron here at the top, I think this is the most interesting part of her chart. And Chiron actually relates to childless cat ladies, and that's a whole other theory that I've talked about some on Instagram. I'll eventually make a video about that. But it is pretty wild to me that that label has landed on her when she has such a visible Chiron. So it's Chiron in Pisces in the 10th. This is also the asteroid Vesta, also in Pisces, and then Saturn in late Aquarius. So having multiple planets in this public area of the chart means that Kamala's public face, her legacy, are very important factors. But it's also Saturn and Chiron up here, 2 planets that are known for making things uncomfortable. And Vesta is a really interesting placement too. There's something that I have tracked for years now, but I don't quite understand it, where Vesta is highly involved with the American political elite, both in their natal charts and in times of significant transformational transits for these people. Vesta is very prominent. I think that it has to do with karma from ancient Rome, but I don't know what that really means. Anyway, very interesting to have that placement so prominent. I will say a little bit more about that in just a bit. But Chiron in the 10th is also very significant because it's directly opposite all of this intense childhood energy. Chiron is a karmic wound in the natal chart. It's a place in life where we feel like there's a weak spot, bad luck, a deficit. It can feel like a place where we just always fuck up. To have Chiron in the 10th means that this wound is going to be very public. It's going to feel like there is a wound in the person's career or reputation. It's going to be visible. And Chiron himself in mythology is a teacher, a guide, kind of guru-like in a way. But as a centaur, he's also inherently an outcast. So Chiron in the 10th might be someone who feels called to be a leader, but could also feel undeserving or not recognized for its abilities or unable to get where it's trying to go. And ultimately, in Kamala's case, I think that she has been screwed over, like thrown under the bus, been an actual victim in one way or another in career situations. I do have to mention that people allege that she's on benzos sometimes or some kind of drug. And that would also resonate with Chiron and Pisces in the 10th. Pisces is associated with addiction and escapism, numbing, dissociation, being halfway off the earth. And this Chiron, again, is a very physical placement. And especially, I think, before she became the candidate, before Biden dropped out, we did see her in some public appearances with her eyes barely open and kind of slurring her words. So I do feel like it has been better in the past few weeks, but that was something that I was very aware of, before I was even looking at her chart, and it would make sense with this placement if she had some kind of issue like that. Pisces can also be deceitful. And going back to the Gemini rising, over the course of Kamala's life, it's obvious that she changes what she stands for, what she's about. You might even say how she identifies according to what will support her ambitious goals of the moment. I mentioned code switching, which both Gemini and Libra are great at, while Pisces is more of a formless energy that can be easily projected on. But the wound is visible, for example, in my humble white opinion, when Kamala is on black talk shows. I watched some clips researching for this, and it just definitely does not sound like AAVE is her first language, and she is really trying hard to sound like it is. There's also her record as Attorney General, which is pretty horrific. Lots of prosecution of nonviolent crimes, prosecuting poor Black people for low-level marijuana crimes while letting police and sheriff's departments get away with massive corruption. One thing that she is notorious for is her truancy initiative, which prosecuted parents for their kids missing school in an effort to combat absenteeism. And that's just really interesting with Chiron in the 10th, opposite what I speculated might have been these like kind of severe or harsh energies that were around in her childhood. So I'm not trying to make excuses for her record as a prosecutor, but with this alignment, there definitely could have been some energies kind of left over from childhood, a feeling of pressure, a feeling of needing to achieve the goal no matter what, and maybe even truly trying to do something good, but getting caught in the whole messed up power game. Mostly, though, really beyond anything else, I think that this Chiron relates to her being a woman of color, trying to make it in the patriarchal political world. It's just like I was saying with the Willie Brown situation, where as a woman, you can feel like you need to use that extra edge of sexuality to climb up a ladder that's just so unfairly rigged against you. It can feel like that is the only power you have. And whether or not, somebody goes the route of using their sexuality to deal with that, it's pretty much guaranteed that a woman of color like Kamala would have experienced racism, misogyny, discrimination over and over again in her career. Chiron and Pisces can definitely have a victimized feeling to it, and I wouldn't be surprised if she has been a legit victim in her career at times, even if it's not what she plays up these days and it's not what we immediately see when we look at her history and her record. She could even have some resentment related to that still kind of hanging out in her energy field. And I think all of this also relates to Saturn here in late Aquarius, also almost at the top of her chart in the 9th house instead of the 10th. So Saturn in the 9th in a natal chart often indicates some kind of oppressive religious or spiritual conditioning and or a very dominating parental presence. So cycling back to her childhood, this is just a little speculation about some of the darker potentials here. I have seen many charts where Uranus and or Pluto conjunct a personal planet in the 4th house has corresponded to some kind of abusive situation experienced in childhood. I don't think that Kamala and her sister were necessarily abused, but her father could have been very dominating and maybe abusive to her mother. They would not have been the only couple in the Black liberation movement living out very patriarchal, unliberated dynamics in their relationships. For hetero activists of all colors in the 60s and 70s, that was a big thing, a big issue. And Kamala's mother also comes from a very patriarchal tradition and could have already been conditioned towards accepting abuse from a man. It sounds like her parents got married pretty quickly in California, far away from Shyamala's family, and her family was upset because she hadn't even introduced them in person. Typically, she would have had an arranged marriage. She also comes from the highest caste in Hinduism, the Brahmins, the quote-unquote priestly caste. And I really recommend the book, The Trauma of Caste by Thanmozi Soundarajan to learn more about how oppressive and insidious the caste system is. Kamala took long trips back to India as a kid and met her extended family, and I would imagine she'd have been indoctrinated about caste. High caste Indian immigrants in the United States want to argue that caste isn't an issue anymore, the same way that white people want to think racism isn't an issue anymore. But caste is a very discriminatory belief system and practice which high caste immigrants bring with them and act out here in the United States in various ways. It's particularly a big problem in the tech sector. So there could be a belief of spiritual superiority ingrained somewhere in here that resonates with white supremacy and with Zionism. She believes that she comes from a special lineage. That's pretty typical. That's what people who believe in the caste system believe. So Saturn at the top of the chart, I think, can speak to multiple layers of authoritarian or rigid or severe conditioning that she was exposed to as a child and that she started to manifest in her own self through her own body as she got older. So Saturn at the top of the chart in Aquarius, it really does give Attorney General. It's an authority figure, which is Saturn, chosen by the people, which is related to Aquarius, to enforce the law, which is Saturnian. I mentioned Kamala's first Saturn return happened right around the time of the Willie Nelson affair. And then her second Saturn return happened in late 2022. So real quick, let's look at Kamala and Biden together. So Kamala's chart is the inner circle, Biden's chart is the outer circle here. There's more here than I can fully get into, but you might notice Biden's south node here at the top at 0 degrees of Pisces conjunct Kamala's Vesta and midheaven. This is the astrology that made me predict the switcheroo back in November when I made my prediction that Biden would not make it to the presidential race and the Democrats would find a way to put Kamala in instead. The south node at the top of the chart, like it just kind of looks like a handoff, a pass off, a karmic transfer of energy. And then, so Vesta, like I said, this is a complex archetype that I don't feel like I fully grasp, but it's associated with the Vestal Virgins in Rome. And so there are themes of sacrifice and themes of devotion that come along with Vesta. And when I think about this pass off, right, this transfer of candidacy that the Democrats organized in a completely non-democratic way. Did Kamala even have a choice about this run? Would she have backed out or wanted an open primary if that had been possible? Was she sacrificed to the will of the party without her full consent? Biden's Chiron is at 28 Leo. So it is exactly opposite Kamala's Saturn. And then Saturn was, like I said, her second Saturn return was in late 2022. So when some of these energies were starting to condense and you know, maybe make themselves visible inside of some of the political circles. So I think, you know, this Chiron, like I said in my Biden video, it speaks to his pride, his arrogance, in this case, him taking so long to withdraw from the race. Kamala did not have a choice, right? She had to acquiesce to the pace of his decision making. Then she had to take the reins quickly in obviously a not ideal situation for a presidential hopeful. And, you know, I can say that it's the Democrats, but ultimately, and I think the astrology really proves this, ultimately it is fate. It is karma that, you know, nudged her into that sacrifice. So obviously it remains to be seen what will happen, and I'm saving my election predictions for the final video in this series. But I will say that Saturn is conjunct Kamala's Chiron in the election chart. And if she loses, this would align. It would signify her getting screwed by Biden's white man pride and stubbornness. And like I said, it's maybe not the first time that something like that has happened. Even if she does not lose, what's going on for her at the election is very uncomfortable. There are also some interesting overlaps between Kamala and Trump, which we will just take a quick peek at here. So now we have Kamala's chart in the middle and Donald Trump's chart on the outside. I couldn't find any pictures of the two of them together. So Trump and Kamala are both born at full moons. And they both have almost the exact same nodes, with Kamala born just about 18 years after Donald Trump. So here's Kamala's north node, 24 Gemini. Here's Trump's north node at 20 degrees of Gemini. Anyone born at a full moon is a big presence. Like I said before, Kamala's full moon in Aries in the 11th. It makes her very powerful with crowds. And it makes her a really powerful rival for Trump because she can match his presence. And this Aries moon in particular, it's a warrior. Like Aries is not here to play. It's not here to mess around. It will take Trump out in whatever way it thinks it can. Kamala, with this full moon, she can also go full out in her campaign. She can throw herself fully into the role that she's playing in a way that not everyone can. And so there's an energetic match between the two of them, but it also is kind of like two North Poles, right? Two like opposing magnets when you have two full moons unto themselves. They kind of repel each other. So it makes me very curious to see their debates, if they actually happen. If Kamala had something she deeply believed in, if she had a deeply held values, this Aries moon could promote them. It could say the hard things. It could be a real truth teller and a real leader. But unfortunately, I do not read Kamala as having any deeply rooted morals. I think that it's her ambition that's running the show. And so instead, the Aries moon gets used by the ambition. It gets used to charge forward with no policies listed on her campaign website, just multiple donation buttons. The Aries moon also helps her take this kind of mocking, unintimidated posture towards Trump. And it gives her the confidence to try to activate the Democratic base in a way that hasn't happened for a while. That would definitely be something that an 11th house Aries moon could be good at. But I think that it will be tough for her to utilize the full power of that moon when she's walking such a morally tenuous edge. Her momentum may fizzle out if she ever starts doing real press interviews or releases policy positions, both of which she has completely avoided so far. And Chiron also transits her moon. It's not till next year, but it will be interesting to see how that transit goes for her too. One final interesting piece that I'll mention, in late April, Jupiter was conjunct Uranus. That was at 21 degrees of Taurus, so it was almost on Kamala's Jupiter here in the 11th house, and it was in an exact square to her natal Mars. So I just wonder if maybe it was around that time that her team started planning for her to take over, even if it wasn't guaranteed that Biden would drop out or when he might drop out. One thing you can't deny is that Kamala and her team have swung into action in a pretty powerful, high energy, coordinated way. And things can move fast in politics sometimes, like that's just part of the rush of it. But I don't think this came completely out of nowhere just since the end of June. Kamala clearly has young people who are working for her. She has competent people. She has people who know how to run a campaign. And they probably started having conversations around that time. That's the third house Leo Mars that activates and galvanizes and takes initiative. It could relate to conversations with donors also. So I do think, it's obvious that that transit activated her Mars. And I can't imagine what else that would refer to than her and her team swinging into action, to be ready for whatever might happen with Biden down the road. There is a lot more to say about Kamala's transits, but you'll have to tune back in for that once I get to the final video on the election chart. Next up in this series is going to be a read on RFK Jr. All right, so I will finish here. I really hope this video was supportive and interesting to you. Let me know in the comments what I missed about Kamala and all your other thoughts on this astrology. And if you're new here, please hit the subscribe button. If you liked this video, please hit the like button. Check out the videos on Biden and Trump if you want some more grounded, well-researched political astrology. And I will see you again soon.